Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So this is well, the title is slightly different. It changes every week. And so this is the same material that I was supposed to present. And Gal actually mentioned it early today about the poverty impacts of biofuels and especially the renewable fuels program in the United States. So that's what I'm going to talk about. The idea is really simple. If I can get this guy to move, which is okay, very good. So we all know that the biofuel mandate has a positive effect on food prices. Madhu mentioned they were estimated to be much higher before. It turns out that they are muted. But these price shocks, as any economist would tell you, or maybe any intelligent person would tell you, would have distributional impacts, and that's the goal here. Essentially study the effect of the RFS on poverty in India. One country, we didn't want to study global poverty. We have micro level data from India at the household level, and we only look at two types of effects. One is consumption effects. So if I'm buying rice or wheat or corn or sugar, those prices go up. So that affects my consumption basket. So we look at the sort of what we call the compensating variation, meaning how many dollars would someone have to give me to be able to, so that I'm compensated for that price increase. That's one effect. The second effect is on wages. And this is actually quite interesting and counterintuitive because food prices go up. And if you talk to trade economists, they'll tell you there's a lot of evidence that wages go up to some extent, depends on government policy. So we have to calculate how global prices of certain commodities translate into domestic Indian prices, and then that would impact wages, which is a positive impact. So essentially there is a sort of a net welfare that is dependent on which one is a bigger number, okay? So I'm not going to go through the first part of the model, which is imposing a mandate on a global model. It's a partial equilibrium model of 3 regions, US, India, and rest of the world. So very aggregated. Idea is to get intuition. We only consider supply and demand in 6 markets: rice, wheat, corn, sugar, meat, dairy, and other crops. Behind this, there's a long 55-page paper. It's not out on my website yet, but still working on it. But if you are interested, I'm happy to send it to you. We also look at uncertainty and price shocks in different parameters in the model. So there's a lot of application of Monte Carlo techniques. The idea is to obtain a distribution of price shocks for each commodity. So we impose the RFS, and then we compare it to a baseline without the RFS. And so just to give you some idea of the method, so the world prices go up, not so much, and that's, I think it's less than most economists have predicted historically, about 8 to 6% for different crops. And then we estimate those pass-throughs. For certain crops, pass-through elasticities are significant statistically, and for wheat and meat and dairy, they are not. Meat and dairy is not traded. Wheat, we don't have a good answer why. And then we look at the wage price elasticities, like I mentioned to you. How do wages respond to price increases? And this is from individual level national employment surveys in India, about 170,000 people. So the takeaway, poor rural households suffer significant consumption losses. This is because poor people spend a lot more of their budget on these crops. However, they also work in agriculture, so they benefit from increase in wages, wage incomes. Urban households also see a consumption loss, especially poor ones, because they eat rice and wheat and corn. However, they do not see wage rises simply because, as we know from common sense, that urban dwellers do not work in ag-related industries. A few of them do. So the net result is that the RFS creates, but just one more point is that although poor, the impacts in rural areas is less because of the positive wage impacts, there are more poor people in India living near the poverty line. So when the poverty line shifts, you get 21 million new poor. in villages and about 5 million in cities. The net result is 26 million. The interesting thing is that these results are quite robust to your assumption about pass-through elasticities. Do world prices move to Indian markets? Yes or no? The answer is very close, 25.5 versus 26. So this is the US renewables fuel mandate. That's the structure of the model. It's sort of similar to the models that represented by Madhu and the speaker before me. Although it's partial equilibrium, we do not consider GE effects. So you have land use, endogenous land use. So when prices go up, farmers plant more biofuels and other crops. And then we have a crude oil model that essentially the more crude oil you extract to make gasoline, the cost of crude oil increases. So we have those different crops I showed you and transport fuel. That's the market we consider. So I'm going to run through this. This is model validation. The model pretty much validates what happened in 2012. That's the starting period, about 5 to 7% difference from the actual. And these are the prices of food commodities with and without the RFS in 2022. So we assume the mandate works with the first generation and the second generation the way it is right now. And the percent difference, you can see 16% for wheat, 12% for meat, and then the other crops are all the rest of the crops that we do not consider here. That's the price increase in 2022. And here is the picture of the sort of pass-through calculation. So you can see this is domestic, meaning Indian domestic prices. You can see that these big peaks in prices were controlled by the government by intervening in these food markets. So the idea is that world price increases do not automatically transmit into the domestic market. So you have to calculate these pass-through elasticities. So we apply long-run elasticities, and you can see that for rice it's significant, sugar it's significant, for corn it's significant, although corn actually plays a small role in our estimates because for India there is not that much consumption of corn. And grains we have is basically rice plus wheat, and this is we have to consider this because the wage elasticities, that data is grouped for both rice and wheat. So here again, you can see household mean expenditure shares by commodities, and you can see by income decile. So 1 and 2 are the poorest people, and you can see 13% of the typical lowest decile household, they spend 13% of their budget on rice, their food budget. And then it declines as you go higher up the expenditure scale. So the richest guys are spending 2.7, and that's fairly intuitive. So here is our result on consumption shocks, and you can see the consumption effect is on the y-axis and log per capita expenditure. So you might think poor people on the left and richer people on the right, and the negative, it becomes more positive as you go up. So obviously poorer people are hurt the most, and that's why it's regressive. The RFS by increasing food prices is impacting the budgets of poor households the most. And we calculate this both for perfect and imperfect pass-through. And these are the employment shares. So we actually do a NIC sort of 5-digit level. We know every individual's affiliation, whether they're working in rice industry, wheat, sugar, meat, etc. And then we aggregate up to the household level. And that's how, so you can see that a lot of rural folk are employed in grains, sugar, a little bit, and so forth, but not so much urban. So obviously that's again pretty much intuitive. And here is the estimation of wage price elasticities. So the idea is that if for 100% increase in the price of commodities, you may get about a 26% increase in wages. So it's hard to compare that to existing studies, and the methods of some of these studies is a little suspect. But there's one paper I saw in Egypt where they find that the wage price elasticity is 40%. Our results are actually highly sensitive. That's why we estimated these numbers ourselves instead of going to the literature. Because if you assume that wages transmit prices transmit to wages 1-to-1, then obviously you'll get a bigger wage impact. So that's the effect of the price shock on wage income. And you can see again, the blue line, the poor people benefit a lot from price shocks because they make more money. Again, if the price goes up by 100%, your wage might go up by 20%. And there's a lot of literature on India about wage price rigidities in the market. Wages don't go up one for one. Okay, so here is the net effect on welfare, and you can essentially see that it's sort of regressive. Well, for the very, very poor people, it's positive. They benefit from the RFS, but the richer rural people, they are affected by consumption negatively and do not gain so much from wages, so they are impacted less and not positively. And definitely the urban poor get hurt. So it's common sense or fairly intuitive that governments are very worried about people taking to the streets when food prices go up because they are not benefiting from wage increases and they are hit by consumption losses. Okay, so here is our kernel densities, and you can see again that the blue line is rural, so a lot more, because simply even today in India 70% of the population lives in villages. So when the village impacts are much higher, although they are not that impacted by these price shocks relative to urban. So the number of new poor finally is about 25.6 million with perfect pass-through, and imperfect pass-through is 25 million. So it's fairly robust to pass-through elasticities. So just to conclude, consumption impacts are regressive while wage impacts are progressive. So that's good. Urban poor hit the hardest. And again, we only look at India because it's not possible to do a global study. You might think of impact of RFS on sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where there's lots of poor people, or in other poor countries of Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, etc. So if you add up all those numbers, and even though these prices are quite muted, the price shocks, the numbers might turn out to be quite big. So we do not consider other types of income like repatriation from workers, income from asset ownership, like you own farmland that grows rice and rice prices go up, so obviously the value of your asset goes up, but those may be second order in this calculation and may not make big impacts on poverty. Thank you very much.